Today, I'm so excited to welcome Anthony Myint to the podcast. Anthony is the founder of Zerofoodprint, an organization that has come up with an innovative solution to businesses directly supporting farmers to regenerate acreage across California, Washington, and Colorado. Have you ever ordered the grass-fed burger off the menu or bought the regenerative rice and wondered what the impact was? Consuming regenerative and mindfully made products is important. Definitely don't stop doing that. But after running his restaurant in the Bay Area focused on locally sourced food, Anthony realized that his purchasing directly from farmers wasn't making the impact he had hoped it would. On average, only 16 cents of every dollar makes its way back to the farmer. And usually those cents are going towards keeping their operation running, not towards transitioning the next acre. So Anthony founded Zerofoodprint, and the concept is simple: that businesses and local governments implement a tax or an optional tip that can be even a fraction of 1% of their bill, similar to policies that have funneled billions into the renewable energy sector. Zerofoodprint then grants this money to farmers who have applied and are focused on regenerating the next acre of land. The goal is that all businesses, whether they care about regenerative food or not, are participating in systemic regeneration as a climate solution. Here's Anthony. Anthony, thank you for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you on.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me, Paige.
So I want to dive right in. I'm a huge fan of Zerofoodprint and what you all do. My family has worked in the restaurant industry, and I come from a consumer marketing background, so I feel like I offer, a unique perspective for our conversation today. The first thing I want to talk to you about is that you talk about the trillion acre question that you've used to shake up our regenerative agriculture movement, which is, do we change eating or do we change farming? Can you talk a little bit about what that means and why that's important to what you all do?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, a lot of that is through kind of this long voyage of discovery of kind of first trying to scale and advance and accelerate regeneration by changing eating habits, kind of, and then eventually starting to learn that maybe a more direct and faster way to make that change happen would be by working on changing farming itself. And so maybe one one way to unpack that is through an example with beef, because I know that that is like a complicated one. So if you imagine like a million people eating 10 pounds less beef, in theory, we have sort of like had 10 million pounds less demand for beef. Whether or not a company like Cargill produces 10 million fewer pounds or 5 million fewer pounds or zero fewer pounds is a little bit unknown. It depends kind of like on export policy and other things. But if you imagine, the same consumer could use 10 cents per burger, something like that, and be using that to help a rancher implement regenerative grazing on the land, that's kind of like a land management intervention that honestly has nothing to do with changing eating, right? It's just using money to change land management. But then if 10 million people were doing that for, 20 burgers each or whatever, like that would be a lot of money that could put in a lot of regenerative, you know, fencing and grazing management. And so basically just it's almost like the same approach that exists in renewable energy, where you can start to work on consumption, like buying an EV or something, or you could work on production, like sending $1 per energy bill to improve the grid. And so it's like one big both and. But I think that society has so far not really been focused on changing farming itself.
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing for us to wrap our heads around, right? Because we think, oh, well, if I go and I buy the regenerative burger on the menu, that's making the most difference. But your hypothesis is actually based on economies of scale and how businesses are structured in their individual policies, that it's actually probably better to take the money you would have spent on the regenerative burger premium and have that go towards a specific regenerative initiative versus just buying the regenerative meat.
Well, I'm not sure I would say better, but that society kind of needs both. So I think we want to support the regenerative rancher and have that kind of community level uh, circular economy and etc. But I think not everybody can afford that burger. Not everybody has access to that burger. And so 10 cents from the regenerative burger or 10 cents from the McDonald's burger, all of it could just be going towards regeneration.
Right. And I mean, you saw that you opened a restaurant, right? And you were sourcing locally, you were sourcing from regenerative farms and it's not that that doesn't make a difference and isn't important and all of us that can do it should do it, but you're essentially saying that hey, where you saw the greatest need and what wasn't happening is zero food print, which maybe you can go a little bit into why you transitioned from, running a restaurant that was implementing these policies to the organization that you've created today.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, the motivation in the first place was kind of having a daughter and just thinking a lot about food and climate, and then learning about regenerative ag, so wanting to focus on that. And then, as you mentioned, we did that in a couple ways. So one was a restaurant that was championing regenerative ag all the way back in like 2015 or so. Um, and then after several years of running the restaurant, we started to talk with the farms, talk with the ranches, and kind of just ask like, hey, I've been paying my invoice for, 3 years, just kind of trying to understand how that helps you kind of implement the next regenerative practice on the next acre. Like, how is it really making the change happen? No judgment. I just want to understand. And oftentimes those conversations were just like over beers, we're friends at this point, allies. And it started to become clear, like, it doesn't actually change the next acre. It's really
Mm.
important. The farm might go out of business if we weren't supporting them. Not saying it's not important, but if society's goal is like to change millions or billions or a lot of acres, then we need to pay to change acres. Like farmers can't take on all the risks themselves, and I think the pace of climate change is just so quick that like we have a fire season, we have the Colorado rivers like running out of water. Like things need to happen more quickly than a few people buying nice ingredients can make happen.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's something I saw a lot like working in marketing for these food businesses is that you're, doing your best to source in a way that makes sense, but the impact all the way down the chain, it's not necessarily flowing evenly, right? All the way down the supply chain. It's not necessarily having the impact that you want it to have. And so with Zero Foodprint, can you tell me a little bit more about how you target certain projects, how you look at the next acre? Are you also mobilizing down the supply chain in terms of helping these producers even find outlets to sell their meat or, sell their products?
Yeah, so we are basically engaged in two functions. One is helping businesses create this impact in the first place, kind of giving them a way to use a penny or a dollar or anything to kind of influence this change in farming and accelerate regeneration. So for businesses, a lot of our business members are participating by sending 1% of sales. And sometimes that's an optional fee. Sometimes they incorporate it into their pricing. Sometimes they just internalize the costs, whatever the case might be. It's a little bit like the 1% for the planet model, except in this case, kind of like as directly as possible to the planet. And then on the farm side, we're basically just inviting farms and ranches to request funds. Unlike a lot of other grant programs, it is a very clear and transparent request that is just linked to a scope of work. I want to apply compost on 14 acres. I want to plant trees and shrubs on 2 acres. I need $14,000, something like that. The requests are all based on sort of like agreed upon practice standards, which the USDA's natural, excuse me, the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service provides. So just sort of like if you were planting cover crop, you would use 40 pounds of seed per acre. You would use an approved seed mix, etc. So the farmers are just making these requests, and then we're sort of sorting all the requests in order of cost effectiveness, and then giving out the grants to, the best project, then the second best, then the third. We're also giving boosts for equity and circularity. So kind of getting at your question of like, up and down the supply chain. Farmers in the supply chain of our participating businesses get a boost in the selection process.
Mm,
But we're not like limiting the funds only to those supply chains.
right.
We also have kind of a nascent other program where we are just directly working with companies to implement projects in their supply chain.
Mm, yeah. And you mentioned 1% for the planet. That's an organization that some of the food companies that I've worked with have participated in. Can you describe maybe the difference or like what, the difference in both theory and practice?
Sure. So 1% for the planet's amazing. We love Patagonia and everything that they stand for. And um, kind of at the nuts and bolts level, the way I believe their program works is if a company, had $1 million of sales in a year, they would send receipts to the organization, kind of showing that they made donations commensurate with 1%. I think not all donations have to be cash technically for 1% for the planet. But in any case, so they're essentially like sending proof that they made the donations to a number of approved beneficiaries, typically environmental nonprofits. And then the way Zerofoodprint is working is we are directly collecting the money and then we're implementing, sending it out to these farm projects. So it's a little bit more complicated because we actually have to collect the funds and then deploy them. But in that way, we have the ability to try to optimize the use of the funds. And so this is not a judgment on any nonprofit or anybody's work, but instead of being a donation to a nonprofit, this is just kind of like a pass through where the funds are going directly to the next project, the next acre. And so for anybody who is kind of interested specifically in regeneration, the next project on the next acre, then that's the service that we provide.
Yeah. And you guys are kind of, in doing that, you're almost sort of filling a gap between what farmers are working on, what the government is providing. And there's this sort of integration component, right, that doesn't exist that you guys are helping to steward.
Yeah, thanks. I think that we started when we began the program in earnest, it was with the state of California and a lot of discussions with policymakers and conservation experts. And so we started to envision the transition in agriculture as this like really huge endeavor for society, kind of like the energy transition. And so if you think about the energy transition, there's like, in each state, dozens of businesses working on various aspects of the transition. I think food and farming doesn't really have that yet. And so you have government grants. Oftentimes the government doesn't have enough money or they don't have staff. And so I think part of the work that we do is capacity that would allow uh, more regeneration in a given region. So sometimes we're working as a government contractor, kind of helping them deploy government funds. But then the biggest challenge is that there's just not enough government funds. So one example is like we're working in the state of Washington with some folks, and they have a $1.5 million grant program. Um, Washington has 15 million acres, so that's like 10 cents per acre. I
Yeah.
don't think you have to be a farmer to know that you're not going to make much progress for 10 cents per acre. And so the longer term goal would be that Washington would pass legislation or local ordinances that there might start to be $1 per trash bill to advance healthy soil. Maybe restaurants and hotels would participate voluntarily, but then also like maybe 5 or 10 years from now that it could start to just be the new normal. So in a lot of states, we have programs like $1 per energy bill to improve the grid or 5 cents per can or bottle for recycling. And so I think we're just at the point in resources and climate and everything um, that society basically needs to start paying for healthy soil and regeneration.
Yeah. Um, it's interesting too, like what came up when you were talking about this is that I have a lot of friends that run nonprofits in the space and, other friends that are, run private investment. And what we've seen with the current administration is like a lot of these grants are getting pulled back. Like a lot of the organizations I work with are losing funding, and private funding and investors are also pulling back a little bit. Like there's this economic fear, right, of recession. And um, are you seeing that with this sort of like mass tax? There was a term you used for it in your position paper, but this sort of mass tax, are you seeing the same level of fear or pullback from business or consumers?
Um, while there is this incredible chaos and upheaval, we've seen on the farm side like a lot more demand for grants. So in the past round, we had like 360 requests for $7 million for grants. Um, on the consumer side, there's also kind of increasing research showing that consumers want to take action. So even like this week, a study came out from the Harvard Business Review saying that um, once like the sustainability certification or whatever credentials went live, products saw a 13% increase in sales. Um, PricewaterhouseCoopers did a study in the fall of 2024 saying consumers will pay 9.7% more for the sustainable choice, even amidst rising costs and inflation and everything. So I think that, it's this weird thing where it's like nobody, you yourself, if you were getting a burger and there was 10 cents going towards regeneration, you would be like, great, and if you could opt out, you wouldn't opt out probably. But by the same token, businesses are kind of in this really hard stretch where it's hard to find staff, prices are changing, this and that. And so I think overall, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road is like, can society go from paying nothing for healthy soil and regeneration and this transition to anything at all, even if it's 1 penny? Can we go from nothing to 1 penny? Um, Hawaii just passed a law where it's, I think, 3/4% on hotels. So you're going to Hawaii, the hotel's $200. The tax was 10%. Now it's 10.75, percent or whatever. So you're paying like 15 extra cents. Like it's almost nothing. That's 100 million a year for Hawaii to implement climate solutions and nature-based conservation work. So literally just going from nothing to something is all that let's at least just start.
Right. Well, and it seems like from what you're describing, it's still impacted and it's complex, but maybe less impacted than some of these other sectors are being in it. And it's a more implementable and recession proof approach, which is cool to hear. One of the things in your position paper that you talked about is that currently federal subsidies only equate to 1% of the total food economy versus 50% of the fossil fuel economy, which I found really shocking because I've always thought that federal subsidies of large monocultures and crop insurance not supporting a lot of these regenerative practices is one of the biggest actual barriers to transitioning to a regenerative model. But that statistic suggested to me that while still a barrier, it's maybe not as much of an uphill battle as the perception. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I would say, first of all, thanks for digging into some of the stats and the research. Uh, I wouldn't say it's not a barrier because it's a huge barrier. It's keeping a lot of farmers from making the transition, but it's so overcomable, if that's a word. Like it's this massive barrier, and yet if the economy did anything instead of nothing, then we could totally solve it right away. Another example I'll give is like in California, I think our model is around 1%, but let's never mind 1% again for a minute. Let's even say 0.1%, so a tenth of a percent. So if you were going to the grocery store or going out to dinner and you spent $100 in California, and then 10 cents extra went towards healthy soil and regeneration, in California, that would be like over 200 million a year. So, the subsidies exist and they prevent action, but any kind of regional, like a city or a county could take action, a state could take action. And if the economy used any amount, we could overcome the subsidies and make all the change happen.
Yeah. And just for scope for people, you might not know the exact number for California, but what is roughly the federal subsidies for California if we're comping it versus this 200 million number or nationally, if you know that number better?
Yeah, so I don't know the apples to apples on that. But I mean, nationally, the 0.1% would be the full amount of the federal subsidies, basically. Like you know, it's powerful. It would, I guess, the idea that each city or county or that collective regeneration can spread is really backed up by the numbers. Um,
Yeah.
I think the main issue is that we haven't really tried it yet as a society.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And um, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the first question that we talked about, which is a consumption versus production approach, because this is something, as someone who spent, over 10 years in consumer marketing for packaged goods company, it's something that I've tried to dive into a lot is like, this people generally want regeneration or sustainability or whatever term they know. They generally want healthier food. Some of them have connected that to healthier soils. And we keep doing this work to educate people to have them understand, the links to biodiversity and the links to water and the links to social welfare and why all of this stuff matters. How much does that actually matter versus them just having this general idea that I care about it and I want to buy in and why is maybe, this production approach going to be more beneficial in this short term and help us reach our climate goals more than maybe, there's a lot of investment going into the consumption approach. There's like a lot of regenerative certifications, regenerative brands that I love, that I support, that I think are amazing. I understand that I also exist within a bubble and this is my life's passion and work. So I'm willing to dive in and understand it and care deeply about it, and understand what that means. How is a production approach less of an uphill battle for us collectively, and how can it support the consumption approach, and how do they work together?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the heart of it. And I think you come from that world. I came from that world as well. And so I mean, the first thing to say is that organic, as an example, is like the fastest growing, sector, et cetera, et cetera. It's like 6% of the food sales, and it's still less than 0.5% of acres after 50 years of organic certification and all the efforts that we've all put in around awareness and nutrition and everything. And so I think the consumption-based approach can succeed and is important, and it can't succeed alone, basically. And so I was saying before, like both and, I think that it's just a big both and where society hasn't yet even started to internalize the externalities across the economy. And so it's like with the uh, kind of like using recycling as an example, you need people to buy the 100% recycled content product, and for that kind of pull mechanism in the market. And you also need 5 cents per can, to drive recycling and kind of have that push mechanism. And so, you know, I think that there's a very clear and direct translation between any dollar that is in that push mechanism. $1 million is generated, almost $1 million goes directly into the next practice on the next acre. If you look at kind of consumer price premiums, if somebody pays an extra dollar for something, I think in the food economy writ large, Marion Nestle or somebody estimates like, maybe about 16 cents ends up going to the farmer.
Yeah.
So first of all, I wish more than 16 cents were going to the farmer through this price premium. But then also, even that 16 cents going to the farmer is not sort of like contractually driving some change on the next practice on the next acre. Like the farmer maybe is using that to put their kid through college or buy a truck or, fix a broken tractor, whatever. Um, it's all valid, of course, uses of money, but it's just that the premium is not connected to any kind of transition or the actual change itself. So it's sort of just a reward for farmers who are good. And I think it's not a strong enough incentive to compel the next farmer who has their own challenges and debt and their back is up against the wall, just because their neighbor's making a premium after having undertaken some risk. I don't think it's enough to drive the change as quickly as we need.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, you brought up organic, and that's a statistic that a lot of people turn to, and it's disappointing to a lot of people that work in the industry for all the years. And a lot of our organic is imported. Like that difference between that 0.5 and that 6% is import, right? I think one of the things that doesn't get talked about as much is that there's a lot more acreage that's organic. It's just not certified organic, and a lot of
Sure.
these farmers have had trouble paying for, maintaining, being a part of that organic certification. This isn't necessarily connected to Zerofoodprint, but I'm curious, as a restaurateur and as someone who's worked in food systems, how do you think about the local food economy versus the national food economy? And then, sort of as a second question, you guys are working nationally. It sounds like I didn't ask that, but I think you're working nationally. You know, how many of your farmers are serving the national economy versus exporting their product? And do you care about that? Or, how do you think about our national versus international food economy?
Sure. So first, we basically began in California and then expanded to Colorado, and now also work in Oregon and Washington in terms of our state level grant programs. And then we also are implementing some projects in other states and beginning kind of broader work across the US. But I think a lot of our work is still really based in California and Colorado and Oregon and Washington. And so then in terms of kind of that bigger question of like import export, um, in a way, we almost are not even focused on ingredients. We are just focused on kind of uh, creating a regenerative economy in a way. And so trying to have, the Subway sandwiches in Boulder, Colorado, send a couple cents to help regenerate in Boulder, would sort of be like the long-term vision where you can imagine the agriculture in Boulder starting to become like 5% regenerative, 10% regenerative, and not necessarily regenerative certified, but just, healthy soil,
Yeah.
20% more, 30% more. And so that same kind of approach as renewable energy has, where, let's just recognize that the energy grid might sometimes have coal power involved, but nobody is sort of like, uh, I need new energy lines coming to my house, to get the energy from the community solar project to my house. Like we're not really concerned with purity in that way when it comes to
Mm.
energy because it's just a commodity. It's all the same in a way. But so we're able to make progress more quickly because of that. And so I think
Yeah.
the suggestion here isn't to ignore the ingredients in purity, but more like just layer on this other approach
Yeah.
that is ingredient agnostic and more like just a resource reallocation.
Yeah, I love how pragmatic it is. I think not in a bad way, but I'd even consider myself a purist. And I think a lot of the time, like when we look at our food system as like it's okay for me as an individual to be a purist in my own consumptive decisions. But when we look at agriculture as a whole, like we don't think about it that way, right? Like if I'm a mom, I'm shopping at Costco. If I buy commodity wheat, I assume I'm buying 100% glyphosate sprayed, GMO wheat, because I don't trust our food system and I understand what happens. But what you're almost saying is like, if we can help fund and shift these commodities to where I might not even be aware of it, but 10% of that wheat might be regeneratively farmed wheat that, you were supporting a farmer in the transition. It's just a really interesting frame shift that I think is important for some of us to think about because we have become in some ways really precious about it and it's important, but it's also like the clock's ticking and we need to start making these big shifts and maybe be a little bit less precious and purist about our approach.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's the perfect example. I also shop at Costco, and I think that's the world we live in. And I would love that if the wheat from Costco was 10% regenerative, then 20%, then 30%, whether or not it was certified. But just kind of having that progress, the next acre of cover crops, the next acre of a farmer choosing to replace fertilizer with compost. Again, whether or not it goes to the same big mill as right before they implemented the practice, but the progress is happening. So I think that's our goal, and we don't even view it as like, you know, uh, to your point in a way, like if that Costco wheat was now $2 instead of $1, that's one thing. But if it's $1.01 instead of $1, like, we almost like can't afford not to have that happen.
Right. Yeah, it makes so much sense. I want to read a section from your position paper and then almost rank some aspects of the movement in importance and have you help me with that because I think a lot of what your position paper did for me in reading it was a really important frame shift about how I think about the movement outside of me as a consumer. And so maybe if you'll bear with me on this little exercise.
Sure.
So, in your position paper, there's a statement that really hit me, which is we will make the case that US farming practices are barely responsive to changes in food purchasing. And in fact, changing our food system will require us to shift our attention from the economics of eating to farming, from retroactive rewards to proactive resourcing, from purity to progress, and to generally expand our frame of reference from individual choice to systemic regeneration. Um, that really hit me. I felt like it was a really important statement. And so, could you rank for you in order of importance in terms of a transition to systemic regeneration and acres of land regenerated, political policy, consumer awareness and advocacy, corporate responsibility, federal investment, and certification/verification?
Okay. Wow. Well, so this is probably uh, could be unpopular with some people, but I might put certification lowest on that and policy highest on that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that the reality of corporate America is just that companies have to serve shareholders and deliver profits. And so I think as we were establishing our B Corp restaurant, the Perennial, we kind of asked the lawyer, like, hey, I want to establish this as a B Corp. He was like, okay, just check this box. And I was like, oh, I thought there was the whole, certification and process. And he was like, that's, for the marketing certification, and the IRS just cares whether you check this box or this box. And it was like, what's the difference? And he said, if you check S Corp or C Corp, you have to send 100% of profit to shareholders. If you check B Corp, you don't have to. So it's like literally if you chose to send a bunch of money to, regeneration, the shareholders could sue you in theory. And so companies are constrained in the amount that they can even fund this transition, even, whether or not they're greedy or, no moral judgment, but just like in terms of corporate law. So I think in order for corporations to fund this transition at scale, there really would need to be almost like the requirement, the shift in business as usual.
Mhm.
And so I'm saying this not as a policy organization, but I think that what our business members are demonstrating is basically that uh, policymakers could make these policies.
Hmm.
If a cool chef is sending 1%, if Subway sandwiches is sending 1%, if the compost company is sending 1%, then it makes it a lot easier for the city council person or county supervisor to create a policy that's setting 1%, or 0.1% or anything instead of nothing. And so we're basically trying to have this pathway that is pragmatic and allows a business to take action, but in an ideal world, that action would also influence policy. Um, and so to me, that's number one, that combination of public-private collaboration and policy change, in part because governments also don't have budgets. And so that's kind of where you said like the federal government funding it. I mean, of course, if the federal government just sent hundreds of billions of dollars to this change, that would be great. Um, but I don't know that it's realistic. And so I'm not sure, I don't know enough about federal policy to know if a lot of people cared a lot about it and worked on it, would it change, or would some company pay some policymaker $1 million and everything would stay the way it was or whatever? I don't know that. But I know that because regeneration is so big of a win-win-win, that each city or county could pass a program and they could start regenerating because it's not a black box. Like that person, and um, you know the community and the relationships matter at that local level.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. No, it's such an important discussion because I think we do have to start getting practical about how we're going to implement these solutions and what that looks like. And, I did an interview with the folks at Landcore that do great work because policy has always been kind of a black box for me too. And I'm like, oh, it's scary. And how do you even approach it? And I think it's a really important place to work on. And to your point, at the state and at the local level, you can get a lot of work done without necessarily having to tackle the big thing of federal subsidies, which Aria and Harley are doing, and I'm grateful that they're doing it.
And I will say though, like it's not a diss on certification, because then you imagine, let's just say, magically money appeared and helped a farmer make the transition, then the certification might still help them cover the cost of continuing to plant cover crops, continuing to use compost instead of fertilizer, et cetera. So certification has a crucial role in, like, that premium is important for maintenance for sure, and maybe in some cases driving the change. But with organic, I don't know that it's driven the change enough.
It's
Or
an order of operations thing, right?
right.
Like if this had happened with organic first, followed by everything else that we've done, the movement would probably have been a lot more successful, and there'd be a lot more acres regenerated, and there'd probably be organic in products that aren't labeled organic and everything you're talking about because the support and the subsidization is there. We're getting to the end here, but one of the things that has been coming up for me is you've talked a lot about, the renewable energy market as a comp for what you're doing here. And you've alluded, and I don't know that much about the renewable energy market, but you've alluded that they're further along in terms of this type of infrastructure and that people have bought in and that has funded a lot of the transition. Why do you think that hasn't happened for food, or why is food behind in a way of that transition? Because it's certainly not less important in terms of talking about climate change and the health of our biosphere. It's the numbers would say it's more important. And so why is it behind?
Um, I wish I knew the answer. I guess I would say, if I had to guess, it's because, 99 or some overwhelming percent of us are consumers. And so I think that we are all coming to it with the mindset of, consumption and how I'm going to change my consumption. And we have not really even tried to team up with farmers in that way yet. Like we always talk about, there's a lot of tropes of like we're disconnected. Um, but I think that if someone were uh, farming, they would know that the actual barrier to the change is kind of like an economic budget risk decision about whether, what I'm going to do next year on that field. Do I have
Right.
the resources to make this transition or not? What's the cost benefit? And so if you were, trying to make that transition in spheres that you understand, uh, then I think we are all like kind of making the more rational choices, like in energy. Um, the energy grid wasn't 30 or 40% renewable in various states before, but we're like gradually moving towards this transformative change. But in food and farming, we're so stuck in the consumer mindset that I think we haven't started to really approach it
Yeah.
um, as a land management problem as opposed to a food problem.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I think to your point, it being food for us muddies the fact that it's also carbon sequestration, biodiversity protection, and all these other things for the planet. Whereas the energy grid is just the energy grid. It is
Right.
it is a commodity. And yeah, I just want to thank you, Anthony, because like your purpose paper was such a big frame shift for me, and it's something I've been walking towards for a while. But I think it's humbling and it's also a little bit uncomfortable. As someone who's a foodie, my mom's a chef, my family's in the restaurant biz, like I love food and I view it as spiritual nourishment, all the things, like it's an emotional connection. And I think working in this sphere, it's really important to realize and make the step that you guys realized and integrated with your organization of like, yes, it is all those things. And it plays a very important role in terms of our species being able to continue to exist in a healthy, happy way. And in order for that to happen, we need to start approaching it a little bit differently. And that anti-preciousness, anti-fragileness of approach, I think, is an uncomfortable but important frame shift. So thank you for the work that you've done. And I hope all the businesses listening will go ahead and make the leap and support Zerofoodprint. So
Cool. Well, thanks so much for being open to that shift occurring. And uh, my hope is that businesses start to engage in collective regeneration, whether it's through Zerofoodprint or anybody else or some other way. Like the goal would be that each state or region has dozens of organizations working on this, just like it's happening in renewable energy.
yeah, completely agree. Thanks, Anthony.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us today. If you have a chance to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, it helps us so much. Thanks for tuning in today. Until next time, welcome to the circle.